Hello everybody, welcome to day 3 of Racer Appreciation Week. We are at the Museum of American Speed today with Tim, our museum curator, and Bob, who is just awesome at all things and knows everything in this museum.
Great racing historian. We're so lucky to have him.
Yep, exactly. So Tim and Bob are just going to kind of walk us through part of the first floor. This museum is gigantic, so obviously we can't walk through everything today, unfortunately. And we're going to try and be more focused towards racers and safety since it is Racer Appreciation Week. So we're going to start off here at the 35 Miller Ford race car, which has a really awesome story and history behind it. So I'll let these guys do the talking.
Absolutely. First, I would just say welcome to everybody to the Museum of American Speed. Again, this is Bob. He's our racing historian. Just a little note about Bob. I appreciate him so much. Anytime we get a new acquisition into the museum, he can usually tell us chapter and verse about it, who drove it, who built it, how long it's been sitting in the barn that we got it from, and it's just wonderful. Sometimes we'll have people visit the museum and they'll say, back when I was a sprint car driver and retired in 1968, Bob will say, wait, you actually retired in 1969, and the person will stop and will say, gosh, you're right. So having somebody like Bob is invaluable. We're so lucky to have him on our team, and we're lucky to have you with us too. If it wasn't for racers, this museum wouldn't be here, and Speedway Motors owes you a big debt of gratitude for being our customers and doing what you do. It's such a wonderful hobby and great sport. So yeah, we're starting off here. We want to talk a little bit about the history of safety equipment in racing, and while we're doing that, we'll touch on a lot of really cool cars in the museum and some of the great artifacts that if you've not been to the museum, it'll give you a chance to get kind of up close and personal with them. And if you have questions, by all means ask. Bree's here with us, so she can ask us the questions that you're interested in knowing the answers to, and Bob and I will do our best. Bob will probably answer most of them. Like I say, he's like a dictionary, so we're so lucky. I love this car because this really tells the story of the ride-along mechanic. If you could imagine taking your mechanic in the race car with you, nowadays that just seems crazy, and it was kind of crazy. And Bob, what are your thoughts on that? And what did the ride-along mechanic do?
Well, by 1935, he really didn't do a whole lot. But early in auto racing history, the riding mechanic was really essential to the sport because there were a lot of point-to-point races that guys were out on the open road, and you needed that second pair of hands to help you if the car broke down, you had a flat tire or something broke. And as the sport progressed and we went to the oval tracks, it really wasn't necessary to have that riding mechanic, but they just kind of stayed with the deal. And by 1935, the cars were a little bit better built, so the riding mechanic really didn't have much to do. He had to watch the gauges, he kind of had to watch for traffic around the driver, and watch tire wear, things like that. And that was really about it. So the riding mechanic was getting ready to become obsolete. I think 1937 was the last year that Indy included the riding mechanics. And what was happening basically was this sport was still very dangerous at that time. And the car owners began to realize that if they had an accident where they lost the driver, they could find another driver pretty easy, but good mechanics were tough to find. And so when we lost the mechanics in a race, that became a very serious situation for the car owners. So they decided maybe we should keep the mechanics in the pits, or even put them up above the grandstands and let them watch from there and give the driver a radio. So that's kind of how that went on. But this car was really one of the very first aerodynamic cars of the Indy 500. You can see the wheel fairings and all that kind of stuff on it, and it was really a very modern version of the race car for 1935.
This thing's flathead powered. I don't mean to interrupt, but I think a lot of people are astonished when we tell them that this thing has a V8 flathead in it.
Yeah, and that's one of the interesting things when you talk about how progressive this car was. It still has the old flathead in it, and that's because it was sponsored by Ford Motor Company, and their flathead engine was just brand new, only a couple years old in 1935. So they were trying to, it was an advertising campaign that they were using to get these engines out on the highways and byways.
What a trio of guys: Harry Miller, Preston Tucker, and Henry Ford. I mean, those three guys bringing this car out to the Indy racetrack, that had to be something. Front wheel drive, which was kind of, were there a lot of front wheel drive cars during that time?
Yeah, actually at Indy, front wheel drive was fairly common and had been for a number of years. The application that is uncommon is the independent suspension on all four wheels. And like I say, the aerodynamics were, guys had tried to do a little bit of aerodynamics with the cars, but this was the first car that was really designed from beginning to end with the air in mind, trying to slip through the air a little bit better than what other cars had been.
Wow, that's interesting. Well, we got another car right over our shoulder we should go look at.
Let's go look at that, baby.
It was a good way to talk about safety equipment some more.
Hi, Frank and Scott. Thanks for watching. We appreciate it. And Sarah. Sarah says hi, Tim and Bob.
Well, hello, Sarah, and hello, fellas. Thanks for joining us. What a beautiful car. The Skinny Clemen Special.
Yeah, and this is a dirt track car. This wasn't an Indy car. This was run on the old fairgrounds dirt tracks. It's a beautiful example of late 20s, early 30s workmanship. Of course, Skinny Clemens and Pop Dryer were responsible for this car. Pop Dryer was probably the top car builder in the country at that time. And as you can see, it's a very clean looking car, very nice. But if you'll notice, there are almost no safety factors in the car whatsoever. Now it does have seat belts in it, but at the time that it raced, those seat belts actually were not in it. I think the seat belts were put in there afterwards. Like I say, that was a very dangerous time for the sport. A lot of guys got hurt, a lot of guys got killed. And the thinking was, in those days, if you'll notice, there was no overhead protection at all on this car. And the thinking was that if you got into a crash, the driver was probably had better chances if he got jumped out or got thrown out of the car rather than stayed with the car. So that's why they didn't use seat belts, even if they could have, because they didn't want the car landing on top of them. So they thought, well, we'll just jump out and take our chances on the racetrack.
These guys were like the X Games guys back in the day, right? Like,
yeah.
They had to be the thrill seekers.
They really were. You know, and it was a tough deal. You had, if you'll notice, you got the. I'm losing track.
Oh, the cowl?
Well, around the cowl, you've got the handbrake, you've got the fuel pump there, the hand fuel pump. So these drivers had to do a lot of different things besides just steer the car. There were no fuel pumps on the engine. You had to pump air into the fuel tank in order to pressurize the fuel system and push the fuel into the engine. So going down the straightaways, these guys would be pumping up the fuel pressure, and then in the corner they'd have to be grabbing the handbrake, and they'd have about 20 of their friends all going 100 miles an hour right beside them doing the same thing.
Jeez.
So it was, you had a lot on your mind there. And on dusty, dirty tracks. Most of these cars ran on dirt tracks. It was daytime racing. Even though they watered the tracks, when you have 100 degrees in the middle of August or July or something like that, why they don't stay wet for very long.
Right.
So if you weren't the lead dog, you really had a tough time finding your way around the track sometimes, which led to even more accidents.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of vibration in these cars. They'd shake the fillings right out of your teeth, and that kind of leads us to the car right next to it, which is a car we call the Pup, and it's fairly original. It's got a little patina on most of the parts of this car.
And this was a car, this car did run in Indianapolis, and then it also ran on the dirt tracks. But the interesting story about it, and you'll notice, if Bree can get in there close,
absolutely.
It does have seat belts, and it was the first car to race at Indianapolis with seat belts, and that in and of itself is an interesting story. The year was 1941. At that time, the Indianapolis Motor Speedway was all brick all the way around, and so it was rather rough, and it provided a rather rough ride for these guys. And the driver of this car, a guy named Joey Chitwood, he would be going down the backstretch, and he had a real tough time keeping his foot on the throttle. It'd keep bouncing off because the vibration was so bad. So he came up with the idea of putting in seat belts in the car in order to hold him in the car better. Well, a couple other drivers who were very much against seat belts went up to him and said, "Joey, you can't do this. If you have a crash, you're going to be stuck in that car, and the car's going to land on you, and you're going to get killed." So they made him promise that if he knew he was going to get into a crash, that he would quick unbuckle that seatbelt before he crashed. But the interesting thing is, even though this was the first car with a seatbelt, that seatbelt was not a safety innovation. It was actually a performance piece because he was trying to keep his foot on the throttle and go faster. So it's just an interesting piece of trivia.
Yeah.
You know, when I first saw this car, knowing Speedy Bill and our history, it says Speedway Cocktail Special on the cowl. And I always figured that was an addition that maybe Bill put on the car, but that's not the case. That's been on there forever.
No, Joe Linke, who owned this car, built it. He was a engineer. He worked on engines, and he noticed that a lot of his engines, during cold startups, he would scuff the cams and the cam followers and whatnot. And so he mixed up this elixir, for lack of a better word, to try to prevent that. And it was called the Speedway Cocktail. It also went by another name called Linkite. And what this was, it was a lubricant that actually soaked into the metal, so that when you started up the engine cold, there would still be lubricant there, and it prevented scuffing of the cams and a lot of the top end stuff. So it was basically a top end lube is what it was.
Oh, that's cool.
Steve said he wants to take it for a spin.
Oh yeah, I would love to take that car down O Street here in Lincoln, Nebraska. That's a really neat piece. That's, you know, of all the cars we have in the museum, this is a lot of visitors' favorite car because it really does tell a story, just the way it was left alone, and it has a lot of that barn find feel to it, which is really cool.
For sure.
Well, the car is definitely a survivor. It was built in 1938, I believe, and raced up almost to 1950. So it had a long career, as a lot of these cars did. If they didn't get crashed, they generally had very long careers. They would get updated from time to time, but they would run for a decade or more. Was not uncommon to see in this era.
That's awesome.
You know, one of the things that always sticks with me, Bob, that you talk about a lot, and that's that you have to respect a race car. When I look at some of these cars, you know, I see antiquities, but these were thoroughbreds. That's the word you always use, that you had to respect them because they could get out of whack and get out of your control at any time. You know, it teaches you a lot about respecting a race car and respecting the danger of doing it.
Well, just like we just said, these cars lasted for a long time. The reason that they were so long lasting was because they were good race cars and they were good handling race cars. A lot of the cars back in that day, that they would get wrecked and they would get trashed. Sometimes they'd get pieces of them would go into other cars, but the cars we have here in the museum are real survivors. The Tom Randall car we have over here, for instance, it was built in 1952 and it raced up through about 1970. Ended up, it has an Offie in it here that ran with an Offenhauser engine for the first 8-9 years of its life. And then eventually it had a Chevy engine in it, but this car was a real survivor, and it was a good handling car. A lot of really good drivers ran it, and it won a bunch of races. But as here again you can see, not much in the way of safety equipment, but this car was only upside down ever one time. And that was kind of a guy who was trying to avoid an accident and actually had an accident.
Oh, jeez.
Kind of an unfortunate deal there.
Yeah. That's amazing to me. When you think about wing sprint cars nowadays, you know, some of the, even the successful racers have to have stock in the wing companies because you know, they're constantly replacing sheet metal on their cars.
Right.
But to think this car was only on its roof once, that's unbelievable.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, of course, the danger element was part of that. The fact that these cars were so dangerous, the guys tried to drive within themselves. And, you know, it was a tough deal. Dusty racetracks, these guys were still going pretty fast, even though by today's standards, they were going 5 or 6 seconds, 8 seconds slower than current cars. They were still going really fast. And if you'll notice, you know, 6-inch wide tires, or even narrower than that. The cars didn't have a lot of chassis adjustments. You know, when you brought the car to the racetrack, you could change the gears, you could maybe change the steering ratio a little bit, and that was about it. I mean, other than that, you just had to drive it the way it was. And so these cars, they could be bearcats if you didn't stay on top of them. And it was a tough way to make a living. And the guys really did respect each other. You didn't see a lot of wheel banging and stuff like that, just because of the danger of the sport.
It's kind of off topic a little bit, but while we're talking about it, the thought just came to my mind. You know, the Offenhauser engine, it was always a pricey piece of equipment back in the day. So if you ordered up an Offie engine, you know, what was the expectation as far as having to tear it down, rebuild it? Was it kind of a turnkey thing, or did they require a lot of maintenance and tuning like?
You know, they didn't require a lot of tuning. It kind of depended. It was pretty much a bulletproof engine, and I don't know really back in the day how many races you could get out of an Offenhauser. It probably depended on how tight you wanted to wind it, you know, how much gear you wanted to stick into it, and how lean you wanted to run it. And then, of course, they also had this elixir called nitromethane that they would mix in the fuel. So it depended on how much of that, you know, it just depended on how far you wanted to go. But just having an Offenhauser in your car made you a front runner.
Yeah.
So it was a very big commitment from a money standpoint. I think most of the guys worked on the engines themselves, or they were really a pretty simple engine.
Straightforward.
Pretty straightforward, so they weren't that hard to work on. So it just came down to, you know, do you want to run third today or do you want to win? And if you do, then you're going to take a chance on blowing that sucker up.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Was dirt a factor too? I would imagine on dirt tracks, you know, that would play into how quickly things wore down.
Yeah, There was a lot of dust and dirt. And, you know, that was another reason for wanting to run up front, was because you weren't in all the dust and dirt and rocks and all sorts of other things that would go into you and hit the driver and go into the engine. And that was I think that was one of the real things about the Offenhauser that made it such a great engine, was that it could eat so much dirt and dust and still perform.
That's interesting. Yeah, that's really cool. And you know, I wish we could fire it up for you.
Yeah.
Because you know, prior to knowing much about Offenhausers, I hadn't heard one run. And the first time I did, I'll never forget the sound. I mean, they just have a really distinct sound, and it's like a banshee scream.
What made me a fan when I was a little kid was going out to the Nebraska State Fair and sitting in that big covered grandstands, and when the cars would come out to qualify one at a time, when those Offies would come out, of course the exhaust was always on the grandstand side, which helped. But the sound of that engine would literally hit you in the chest. I mean, you could feel it, and it was just awesome. I mean, I can't explain it any better than that. It was really something. And you knew you didn't need a stopwatch to know how fast the guys were going, because those Offies were so distinctive when the guys were on the gas and distinctive when they were off the gas, that how far down into the corner told you how fast that guy was going, you know.
That's cool.
It was really an awesome time.
Yeah, out of 4 cylinders, it's unbelievable. Well,
4 cylinders, 6,000 RPM, something like that.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
Crazy.
Thanks, James, for watching.
We hope we're not boring anybody to death. You know, Bob and I, once we start talking about racing, I at least get really fired up. I could be here all day, and Bree will have to say, "Come on, guys, let's get moving."
No.
So we're going to kind of walk over here. We've got a little case of some different helmets through the years, And I love these helmets. I mean, we have some Jan Opperman helmets in here.
Yeah.
We've got Mark Donahue. It's some really cool stuff going all the way back. I mean, some of these helmets, what would you say the date would be like on that Fritz helmet there?
That was probably mid-50s.
Imagine guys wearing
Early
that.
50s.
That
Yeah.
no roll bar.
No roll bar. You know, the helmets kind of gradually came into the sport, and it's like every other safety innovation. It took some time for guys to get used to the idea of wearing helmets. It took time for them to get used to using seat belts, roll cages, the whole thing. And the very first helmets were really just a steel bowl with a strap that went around the guy's chin. And I think a lot of what helped helmets become accepted was the fact that you could get hit in the head with a rock or something and it wouldn't split your forehead open. So that was as much a part of it as anything, because helmets did come into the sport rather quickly, and they were accepted a little bit better than some of the other safety innovations that have come along. Now, as we moved along, of course, helmets got better in their design and manufacture.
How old is this Opperman helmet, do you think?
He was wearing that in 1966, 67, 68.
I see.
And then the other Opperman helmet is the one that he wore, I believe, in the 1976 Indy 500.
Yep.
So,
And I
That
love
duct
the
tape.
tape. Yeah. You know, it reminds me like, you know, medieval times, you know, when guys were wearing these suits of armor with a little slit. I mean, and Bob, correct me if I'm wrong, they were doing that to block out sunlight.
there was a lot of glare.
Yeah.
Especially in the mid-70s. If you look at the Indy cars at the time, they were very flat. They were all very flat cars. And it created, at different times going around the track, depending on how the sun would hit the car, a lot of glare. And so those guys tried to close up and just use whatever viewing area that they absolutely needed. Because when you're going 200 miles an hour, you don't want the sun in your eyes. It's just, you know, it's a comfort deal.
Yeah.
We have a Jack Dover helmet down here.
Yeah, that's pretty
Steve
cool.
Kinser's right above Jack there.
Yeah. These are pretty cool.
Some of
Corey
these helmets
likes
look
these.
like they were painted with a putty knife. I just love it. Especially the Jan Opperman helmets. They're kind of
Yeah.
that way with a lot of texture and thick paint. Probably painted it himself, do you think,
Oh.
Bob?
think?
Probably had a friend or something. He may have done it himself.
Yeah.
You know, and then obviously he redid it as time went along too, because they did get chipped up and banged up.
Right.
But it's interesting that you go from the open face style, and we even have one down here that had the leather face mask
Yeah, that's cool.
that the guys would wear. And then when the full face helmet came in, that really was a big step forward for the guys, because you would see guys come in from the races, they'd have bleeding out of their nose and they'd have split lips, and you still see a lot of those veteran guys, they don't have all their teeth, and those open face helmets for the reason. When you're going 100 miles an hour and a car in front of you kicks a rock up and it's maybe going 50 miles an hour backwards, that's a 150 mile an hour impact.
Right.
It doesn't have to be a very big pebble to get your attention.
Isn't that the truth?
And so full face helmets were a big step forward.
When did the first tear-offs become available?
Well, almost with the very first full face helmet. A lot of the times the guys on the open face helmets, they would stack goggles.
Oh.
And then they would pull them down, and sometimes they even had a flip shield that they would use, and then they would just wipe it off with their hands. Well, it didn't take very long with the full face helmets for somebody to come up with the tear-off style, and that was really nice too. Gave you a brand new clear view. You didn't have to be looking through layers of mud or dust or streaky stuff.
I remember working at Speedway in the call center answering the phones, and somebody was really talking thoroughly about an automatic tear-off machine and just how much he loved it. And I think we went through a lull at the time, and we didn't have any in stock, and his stopped working. But he was a one-armed driver, and he said, you know, I only have use of one of my arms. I don't have any way to tear off my tear-offs. And it made a lot of sense. I could about imagine, you know, how much he needed that. But what a cool invention.
And there's an example of one of those right there, that mud eater.
Oh, yeah.
Those were pretty popular for a while, but they had a lot of mechanical problems with them. And if you remember, the NASCAR guys had those cool suits for a while that were basically air-conditioned driving suits. And then they had a couple of hoses that went off into this thing that had dry ice in them. And they were great until they stopped working, and then they were horrible. It was the same thing with these mud eater things. When they quit working, you had no alternative but to flip your visor up. Well, you just didn't want to do that. So the guys kind of came back to the, now a one-armed guy would obviously stay with something like that, but most of the other guys just went back to the regular tear-offs, and that's what they still use today.
As we walk over to the Indy pit, I mean, I remember calling the company that made the electric tear-off machine. And if I remember right, it was in a guy's basement. I mean,
really?
He and his kids were putting these things together. So, I mean, I think it's a pretty cool story in that, you know, sometimes, you know, in the racing world, you know, I mean, it can be pretty small time, but it's an important piece, you know.
It still comes down to individuals. And individuals trying to do something, make something a little bit better than they already have. So,
It was only a matter of time before I tripped. I think everybody who watches my Facebook Live knows that I joke about tripping all the time. I'm not lying, I trip a lot. This is probably one of my favorite parts of the whole museum.
Yeah, it definitely has a nice ambiance. You know, of course, we have some of the original doors from the old Indy garages, which, boy, if those things could talk, you know, I think about that all the time, especially when I walk through this place at night with all the lights off. I mean, it's almost spooky. But you know, down here it is. It's a really nice, a nice place to come to kind of think about Indy and the Indy 500 and some of the things and innovations that have come and gone, you know, with that race. You know, I like bringing people down here. As far as safety equipment, I don't know really all there is to talk about, except we have kind of 3 generations of cars in front of us that kind of tell the story of some of that history. Obviously, that 35 Ford, that Chicago Rawhide special car, that would have been set up for a ride-along mechanic. That was when they were still doing that. Kind of, I know Bill was awful proud of that car. He liked that one a lot.
yeah, that was one of the first cars that I believe he purchased at the museum.
This one was?
Yeah.
Wow.
We also have the Central Excavating Special, which is a dirt track car, but it also ran Indianapolis several times. And mid-50s, it's another one of those Offie-powered cars. One of my personal favorites, actually. This is a gorgeous car.
Yeah.
This car, it looks like a dirt track car is supposed to look like from back in that time.
I feel weird. I've never crossed the barriers back here. I feel like I'm doing something way bad. It's so dark back here, though.
Well, the painting back there is in perspective, so be careful you don't
Yeah,
run into the wall there.
Yeah, right. I already tripped once, Bob. We have someone from Hawaii watching. Hello, Jim. Thanks for watching.
Then, of course, we have the Jim Carnaby's Mallard. This was one of the most famous cars in the history of the Brickyard. For one reason, it was the last front-engine car to race in the Indy 500 in 1968. For another reason, Jim Carnaby's was a very popular character, kind of a, I don't want to say a goofball, but he was just a very legendary figure of the Brickyard. And he kept trying to qualify this car year after year after year for the Indy 500, clear up to like 1981. Well, at one point, he traded in his Pepsi sponsorship for Miller Beer sponsorship. And Miller was a little more serious about their racing than Pepsi was. And at this point, Carnaby's hadn't qualified this car for the 500 for about 3 or 4 years. And Miller wanted to actually be in the race rather than just be a sideshow for the race. And so they convinced Jim to buy a modern rear-engine car, which he did. And the first weekend of qualifying for the 500, he put that car into the show very safely. And then in the week between the two qualifying sessions, he brings his old front-engine Mallard out and practices with it. And this was in the day when they would get 50,000 people to show up at Indy for practice, 100,000 for qualifying. And of course, the buzz was that Herc was going to get this car up to speed and replace the rear-engine car with this car. He was going to pull that rear-engine car out of the race and run the front-engine car. So it gets to be the last day of qualifying, and they roll this car out onto the grid. They roll it into qualifying line, and like I say, there's 100,000 people here, and they're just going nuts. They just think this is great. Hertabees is going to put this front-engine car in the show. Well, it gets to be 6 o'clock, the end of qualifying. They shoot the gun off to end qualifying, and Hertabees goes over. He pulls the hood off the car, and instead of an engine, it's full of Miller beer. And he says, well, we can't race, we might as well party. So it was all kind of just a publicity stunt for the sponsor. And he did race the rear-engine car in the race that year.
And lo and behold, check it out. It says right on the nose, the Mallard, Hillbilly Engineering.
Yeah.
Kind of sounds like my garage.
Well, that came from the fact that Hertabees grew up in Tonawanda, New York, and he had a pond right behind his folks' house, and there were always ducks out there in the pond. And so he became a real Mallard ducks became a real favorite of his. So that's that's how this car got to be called the Mallard.
That's funny.
It's a great looking car.
Yeah. Hi, Jerry from Texas, and Lauren. I hope I said your name right, from Wisconsin. Now we're just walking through part of the first floor of the museum. There are 3 floors of awesome in this museum.
150,000 square feet.
Something.
A little bit of everything.
A little bit of everything. I mean, there are pedal cars on the 3rd floor, so your kids will be happy when they come here. I mean, the pedal car room is my favorite, let's be honest, but...
We hope you'll all come and visit. Of course, we have a pretty impressive line of race cars here. These are all cars that are special to Speedway, including Jan Opperman's car and Doug Wolfgang's. I don't know if there's anything we want to touch on with these cars, Bob. As far as safety equipment goes, there's some pretty interesting stuff going on some of these.
Well, you notice, for instance, on the Jan Opperman car, it has the big mud screen on the front. This goes back to the fact that a lot of the guys were still running open face helmets, and that was to try to keep some of those rocks and stuff out of their way. So that's probably the big innovation there. And of course, the roll cages were a big innovation for short track cars. Saved a lot of lives, made the racing a lot rougher. Guys kind of started beginning to think that they were immortal because they had a roll cage over their heads, and but still, they saved a lot of lives.
Yeah, absolutely.
For sure. All right, let's go back over this way.
One of the things we're really proud of in Nebraska is the safer barrier, and that it was developed here with the help of the University of Nebraska. We have a little bit of a display here to kind of talk about it. We have a section of the safer barrier, and Bob, when was the safer barrier developed?
I'm thinking the late 90s. Actually, our sign says 1998, so I guess that would be correct.
Yeah. I'm going to go walk
Steel
over
and
this
foam
way.
energy reduction, that's what safer means. And this was developed out at the airport by the University of Nebraska. They went to NASCAR and they proposed that this type of a system would work on the big major speedways, and it has proven out to be a big leap forward in safety. There's a lot of guys that attribute the safer barrier to keeping them on the racetrack instead of in the hospital. So,
Yeah, I couldn't imagine what a lot of these tracks were using before the safer barrier. Was it just
Cement walls.
steel girders and
Steel and cement, you know,
Yeah.
and it was not much give to them, and that was the whole idea behind this, was the fact that it would actually flex and allow the car it would allow the fence to absorb the energy of the crash rather than the car and the driver having to absorb all that energy.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's wonderful. And typically, if you visit the museum, we have a wonderful video playing. You can even watch a couple of those crashes.
Yep.
It's really, really fascinating.
Hi, James from New Jersey and John from Missouri. Thanks for watching with us.
One
Oh,
of
we
my
have
favorite cars.
Tony. He shared an Australian and Canadian flag.
All right, cool. If you guys have any questions while Bob and I are walking around, we're happy to answer them. If you want to look at some, if you see something in the background that you're like, hey, I want to have a better look at that, say the word. We're happy to help you out. Just
I'll turn
consider
around.
yourself a visitor here at the museum.
Yep.
I always walk by this 32. I always have to mention it only because that's kind of where Speedy Bill got his start. This particular car, the 4X32 sedan, and it went through a lot of variations over the years. But you know, looking at the safety equipment in this car, kind of makes you cringe a little bit. I mean, obviously, they probably thought it was really safe in the day, but
It's so bare bones in here.
yeah, not a lot of stuff.
This
going
was
on.
probably a little bit of a step backwards safety-wise, but Bill didn't hire drivers that crashed. That was one of the things. If you crashed Bill's car, chances were you were going to be unemployed that next Monday. And he had a guy named Lloyd Beckman driving this car who very rarely ever crashed, rarely ever spun out, rarely ever banged wheels with other guys. He went really fast. He was just one of those very special drivers that had a lot of talent. He was interesting because he was a really good roller skater. And if you think what makes a good roller skater, well, you got to have good balance. And I think that's what makes a good race car driver too. You got to have good balance. You got to understand how the car is reacting on the racetrack, and is it getting enough forward bite? Is it getting enough side bite? And stuff like that. So I think Beckman was a very good choice for this car. And to a lot of people, this car looks kind of like a jalopy, but really it was the next step forward from that because it was built very, very light. It only weighed 1,800 pounds. And we've got a jalopy up on second floor, Tim, that we just weighed this morning. It's 23, almost 2,400 pounds.
Unbelievable.
So you're talking 600 pounds lighter than the cars that it was racing against. So that made this car very competitive. In fact, it was dominant. It was very well balanced. Of course, very light. You had a very good driver. It just had it was a total package.
Yeah.
Yep. They kicked the flathead to the side. They're using a small block Chevy by this time, so they've got plenty of horsepower, which is great. Lightweight. Yeah, that's wonderful.
In fact, there's an interesting story about the engine. Bill, when he built this car, was so dominant that he was actually losing business from Speedway Motors because the other racers were getting mad at him because he was winning all the races. And they had I believe they had a 350. It might have been punched out to a few more cubic inches than that. But Bill decided, maybe it'd be good if we finished second or third one night. So he had Marty Bassett, the mechanic, put together a 302 engine.
Oh, boy.
And put that in the car. Well, when Beckman found out about that, it made him kind of mad because Beckman didn't care about Speedway's business. He wanted to win races. So he drove the car even harder, and it still won, even with that little 300 cubic inch engine.
Wow, that's crazy.
So,
was it normal to put the driver right in the center of the car? Or was that something new to the time, or was that?
it was kind of new for these type of cars. I think a lot of the guys were going to the center of the car, but there were still some guys that were hung out on the left side.
Yeah. I love the fuel tank. I think if I remember right, that's a World War II bomber oxygen tank that they used for a fuel tank.
I think it's out of a B-25.
Yeah,
We had an Air Force, had a base here And when that base closed up in 1962 or whatever, these things were piled up, 2 stories high, and people could just come and get as many as they want. Well, Bill went and got several of them, and they were good for fuel tanks and street rods and race cars and all sorts of things.
Yeah, for sure.
I just bought one at the last Lincoln swap meet. I think I paid like $150. Yeah, I wish I would have lived back in the good old days.
Yeah,
That's
no
one.
kidding.
That is one that somebody picked up for free in
Yeah,
1962.
exactly.
So there
That's
you
kind of
go.
the way that works. Absolutely.
Let's see. We have Al from Texas, Kenny from Nebraska, Omaha,
All right.
Jared from California. Al, I see your really long comment. Unfortunately, half of it is cut off. He said his dad was a mechanic partner in a stock car back in the 50s when guys built the best car they could and would take it to the local racetrack in New Jersey.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, the golden age, you know.
Yep.
I think about that all the time.
Oh man, we have Brendan from London is also watching. You guys
Well,
are
hello.
spreading.
Well,
This
that's
is
cool.
This is one of the rooms that people walk by and their jaws drop. This is the ladies in waiting, and we did a live video in here over the summer with Stacy David. Blanked. But anyway, so if you want to see more of the ladies in waiting room, there is a live video from back in June that you can kind of go and we get more up close and personal with some of these engines in here. So
Actually, Bree, the original quote from Bill was, "These are the ladies that are waiting to get their hair done." These are our unfinished engines that we
that's
have.
funny.
This one's already had the Jerry curl, though.
Yeah.
Look at that. That one's ready to go. That's
Yeah.
ready for prime time. But a few of these, we're always looking for pieces, parts. There's some pretty rare engines in here. There's a Cadillac Flathead back here that
I'm
we
too
just
short to see
recently
that.
acquired, the little black one. That just got back from the machine shop. It was ready to go into somebody's hot rod. Of course, we have the Cutaway 331/392 Hemi, which is really cool. That's been in the museum for a long, long time. And then rare stuff like that Buick nail head with the dual overhead cams on the very end, set up for drag racing. So now this is where I get the fever. When I walk into this room, I just go crazy with all the history and all the cool stuff that we continue to acquire here at the museum. And we're so lucky we get donations from all over the world. You know, people find something under a rock and they say, "Hey, we're in Paul Speedway. They might be interested in this." Thank goodness.
Yeah, for sure.
Talk about a relic from the past. This is an old poster that Bill had made up when he first started selling T-buckets in the 50s and 60s. And I saw an old picture of him in one of the early trade shows where he had some T-bucket parts in this particular sign.
Oh, really?
So I asked the guys if we still had it, and lo and behold, there it is.
Of course we still have it.
Yeah,
We
isn't
have
that
everything.
Cool? Yeah, I just love that old poster.
That's funny. Who else do we have on here? We have Kevin from Iowa. Al keeps, let's see, twin carb Ford 315 that they built in their shop. That's awesome.
Oh, that's great.
This is where the engines get worked on. There's nobody's in here right now, at least.
Yeah, not right now, but we've got a lot of stuff kind of happening. We've got a couple of our old intakes dug out. If you want to look real quick, we've got an Arden flathead conversion set of heads that we just pulled out. We're getting set up with this really gnarly homemade intake for an Arden. You know, Ardens, if you know much about Arden cylinder heads for flatheads, I'm kind of getting off topic a little bit. We're getting into some hot rod stuff.
That's okay.
Arcus Duntov designed these heads to help industrial applications that had flathead engines to get a little more horsepower, you know, big trucks, stuff like that.
Sure.
But then the hot rodders found them, of course, and then they became a performance item. Some of these ended up at the Indy Speedway. A lot of them ended up in hot rods, but they're pretty high dollar now. But what I love about this homemade intake is this kind of harkens back to a day when these were just another performance part and they didn't have the big price tag, and it was just about trying to make your car go faster. So this is a really, really cool display the guys are working on getting this put back together. So,
Really cool. Well, we've got Henry from South Daytona Beach and Adrian from Alabama. Thanks, guys, for watching.
yeah, this is fun. I don't know about you, Bob, but I kind of enjoy this. I don't get to walk around with you every day. We're both usually busy.
And me, hello.
Well, yeah, I agree. She's always fun to hang out with. This is great.
I'm the life of the party, obviously.
Well, we're so lucky to have you and help us show off our museum. We love doing it.
Yeah. Any excuse I can have to come over here for sure.
So, of course, we're entering into our Bonneville and Dry Lakes area of the museum. One of the favorite areas of the museum. Obviously, a lot of really cool stuff.
Yep. I'm going to sneak back behind these barriers and hopefully not trip again.
Yeah, that's a pretty serious Model T powered hot rod. And again, that's another one with a lot of wonderful patina that you just love to take down the O Street and wave at all your friends. It's such a
Right.
cool car.
Right.
Correct me if I'm wrong, Bob. That's got a twin plug Model T block and a Ratio performance
Ratio
cylinder.
head. Maybe a Model A block. I'm not really sure.
Yeah, uses a different frame rail too. Those aren't Model T frame rails. Those are like Pierce Arrow or something odd.
Yeah.
I can't remember exactly.
Well,
what
you
they
know, the
were.
Dry Lakes guys were probably, and still are, the greatest kit bashers in the world. If you're a model builder, you know what that means.
Kit basher,
It means
yeah.
you take several model kits and you take parts out of each one to make a unique car. And that's what these Dry Lakes guys did. They didn't just take Grandpa's old Model T and take the fenders off of it and maybe put better tires on it and take it out to the Dry Lakes. No, they would take the steering out of one car and the frame rails off another car, and then they juice up the engine, put a body on it that maybe was somewhat unique, find a front axle from out of another car, and then take the rear end out of yet another car, and to make their speedster. So a lot of very unique combinations came out of Dry Lakes racing.
Yeah, for sure.
What I love about this blue car, just personally, on a personal note, you know, I grew up when you could still climb all over World War II relics. Like they'd put them out at the parks, you know, when you were a kid, you could climb into, you know, a Sherman tank and see what it felt like. You know, these cars have that utilitarian feel. Like this one particularly, when I look inside, it just looks like a cockpit out of an old fighter plane, you know, from that era. You know, and this is, you know, safety equipment wise, it's really interesting to have an open floor. You know, there's just two little pieces of metal to kind of keep your heel in, you know, to be able to put leverage on the pedals. But other than that, you know, everything's coming up through the floor, all the smog and dirt and grime. I mean,
Yeah.
Well, you know, of course, this car came out of the late 40s, early 50s, and a lot of those guys that were running this stuff back then were all old Army or Air Force guys, Navy guys. So they were used to riding around in tanks in World War II or in Korea or flying fighter jets or whatever. So they would kind of adapt that kind of ergonomics to their cockpits in order to kind of assimilate that, because they understood what they liked when they were riding around in those airplanes or in that tank. And so they tried to recreate that situation with these cars.
Yeah. Makes sense. Drive what you know. I have never noticed that this has like leather and laced up on the spring.
People try a lot of different things to keep the grit out of spring leaves, because obviously they wear themselves out, you know, flexing back and forth. They pack them with oil and grease, and then trying to keep the grease clean, they wrap it with leather. I've seen people take, you know, tape and wrap them up with tape.
Really?
You can actually bind a spring up, you know, by using tape. I've heard that, you know, especially black. Some guys use black electrical tape on modern applications, but they'll say it'll tighten the spring up so much that it doesn't do much.
Well, and that's the biggest thing. If you don't protect it, it'll get dust and grit in there, and then it won't work the way it's supposed to.
Right.
That hurts the performance of the car. It's all about performance. It's all about the end game, which is running a faster time than somebody else with similar equipment.
Nowadays, you can call up Speedway Motors if you're building your hot rod with leaf springs, and you can buy your spring with the little plastic pucks in between the leaves. And it solves that problem. It just makes it too easy. I was thinking about that when I was taking apart my Model A spring the other day. And I thought, oh man, I need some. Of course, we sell the spring liner, even the little plastic strip that you can put in between your leaves, take it all apart. So a lot of ways to solve that problem, but I'm a stickler for the old leather. You know, that's cool.
That is really cool.
Up. That's pretty neat.
For sure.
So, of course, we come into this corner of the museum. This is the one area where we talk only about safety equipment. We've got some really cool artifacts in this corner. Some of it's pretty new. Of course, Bree's over here looking at the world's fastest flathead Ford. Of course, that's the
I got distracted by the shiny chrome.
Yeah, most people would rather look at the world's fastest flathead Ford than a helmet or a neck brace. Yeah, we're going to talk about that more.
Yeah, this stuff is the more important stuff. This is
really
what keeps
cool
you
about
alive.
This is we have the first Hans device. Now, am I off base saying that, Bob? Is this actually the very first?
I think it was the first prototype.
Yeah.
What a cool invention! And
Yeah.
I don't think I really appreciated the Hans device until some folks from Hans came to Speedway and they gave us some training on it, and they showed us the video of crash dummies, hitting a barrier, and seeing how your head just basically wants to detach off your body without being tethered down on that Hans device.
Right.
I mean, being a hot rodder, I'm not as knowledgeable about it as some folks, but I know they're probably not the most comfortable things to wear. You used to race a sprint car, Bob. Did you ever wear anything?
No,
like
I raced in an era before the Hans device. I did have a helmet tether that I hooked from basically where my left ear would be down around underneath my shoulder. That was more just so I didn't have to hold my head up, but it kind of did the same sort of thing as a Hans device. But what the guys have found out is that if you keep your head on top of your shoulders, you've got a better chance of seeing the next day.
Yeah.
So it's just kind of common sense in a lot of ways. And there's a lot of other devices that do a similar type of thing. The Hans devices has become almost like Scotch tape in that the Hans, which is a type of head and neck restraint, has become the de facto name for all these different
Sure.
and all the other companies.
Right.
But the Hans was first, and it's a very good piece of equipment. I think it's saved a lot of lives also.
Fire is obviously, I look up at this picture, and fire is something that every race car driver, I guess anybody's scared of, astronaut or whatever, but I look at this picture and it's unbelievable. We actually put a post on our Facebook page at the museum not long ago of stock car racing in the 50s, and it seemed like every car burst into flames. Wow, it's like a scene from Hades, and every car was on fire. But there have been a lot of innovations to help with that, obviously, when it comes to fire suits. And one thing that always struck me working in a sales environment over at Speedway before coming to the museum is, a lot of folks don't want to spend money on a fire suit. To them, it's all about going fast. Why spend $300 on my suit when I can use that money to make my car go faster? But really, it's the best money you'll ever invest. Obviously, if you're in one of those crashes where.
Well, when I first started racing, somebody told me, if you have a $10 head, buy a $10 helmet.
Yeah.
And I think that applies for any safety equipment that you might buy.
Right.
And we all understand about budgets. We're all on a budget. But you still need to buy the very best that you can afford, because hopefully you'll never need it, but if you do need it, you can't go to Speedway and order it and then say, okay, it's got to be here instantly because I'm in a fire right now.
Right.
It's too late. You've got to already have it by now.
Yep.
That's a really good point. Talking about fire, over here we have Bill Simpson's suit that he put on and lit himself on fire.
Yep.
I talk about having faith in your product.
Those are my favorite commercials from Simpson, is when he's literally in them and lights himself on fire.
Yeah. And the suit fared pretty well.
Yeah.
Brendan wants to know more about the world's fastest engine.
Oh, come on over. Let's take a look. Yeah, we're so lucky to have this particular engine. This was developed by Ron Main and Dick Landy. Now, Dick Landy is a machine shop, and their claim to fame was always Chrysler Hemis, drag racing applications. Dandy Dick Landy, I mean, he was always the guy that was behind some of the fastest stock competitors in the stock class in NHRA drag racing. But he got involved with Ron Main, and they started working on a project to set the speed record for the world's fastest flathead. And there are a lot of cool things you can do to a flathead to give them horsepower. One of the first things people do is put overhead valve conversions on them. But Ron Main decided that once you do that, it's no longer really a flathead. He wanted to keep the flathead, a true flathead, keep the cylinder heads the way they are. But as you can see, everything is custom on this particular engine. Dual plugs per cylinder. The engine, which typically would breathe out of the bottom of the block, now breathes that through the top. The exhaust all exits through the top. And if you come over here and look at these two blocks, this is a great way to kind of show just how much machine work is involved in making this engine happen. But here we have a stock 59 AB block, just how it would look coming out of your 49 Ford or whatnot. And then here is the block after it was machined by Dick Landy. And you can see they completely cut out the valley and created almost like a small block Chevy cylinder head out of the top of the block. They used a reverse cam, so now the exhaust valve is the intake valve and vice versa to help it breathe right. They bored it as large as they could. When they dropped this block off, they told us that each block, and they went through several, was $10,000 in machine work at the machine shop to make it happen. I can't fathom that. Like when my hot rod is done, if I come in under 10,000, hey, you know, that's a lot of money to a guy like me. But to think about that kind of investment. And it worked. You know, they ended up using this engine in this particular car that we have on display, the flat fire streamliner, and out at the bottom of those salt flats. I'm going to have to refresh my memory. I want to say 315 miles per hour with a flathead forward block, which
I think that's pretty close.
Did you guys do a Facebook Live with Ron?
We did, yeah. Okay. Ron was really cool. He actually delivered the car and engine to us. Gosh, probably about 7 months ago.
Was that, did I meet him? I think I did. I think I was here that day that it came out.
Obviously, Ron's a great friend to the museum, and we think the world of him. If you do any research on the SCTA and Bonneville racing, he's heavily involved in that even today. With another car, no longer the Flatfire, now they call it the Speed Demon with Poteet, and they're I think going like 400 and some miles per hour with I want to say they're using some kind of GM power plant. I couldn't say for sure.
That's crazy. But, so if anybody's watching and is curious about hearing what Ron has to say, you can look up the museum's page and look for that live video and go back and rewatch it, because it's definitely super really interesting. Cool if this is what trips your trigger.
Absolutely. I think I'll just show you one more cool thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Before we wrap it up, I don't want to put anybody to sleep, but we talked about Bill Simpson. Over here we have one of his first custom suits.
Oh, this is my favorite. I love this.
This particular car was built by a great guy named Sonny Rossi. It's a Bonneville car, but Sonny had done a lot of racing over his lifetime. He did a lot of drag racing, some of these pictures show. And inside this case is his fire suit. The interesting thing about Sonny is that he's a little person, so he couldn't find a fire suit to save his life. He called Bill Simpson up, who was just getting started in the business, and stitched him up a custom-made suit. We were so lucky to have him here along with Sonny's car. We hope to see him again soon. He dropped this all off, oh gosh, what would it be, about a year and a half ago, Bob? About a year ago.
That's really cool.
So, it's all about great customer service. When you have a customer that needs something, you kind of go above and beyond.
Right.
And that's always been our mantra too here. We always try to do our best to help folks out. But, well, we hope you enjoyed it.
Yeah.
because I know it's just a little bite. Gosh, what we cover, maybe 50,000 square feet of the 150,000 square feet. Yeah,
maybe 20,000 square feet.
It's crazy. You know, it's a wonderful place to come, and you can learn a lot here. I know I learn something new every day, especially when I get to walk around with you, Bob.
Well, with my short-term memory problems, I learn something new every day. A lot of times it's the same thing. Anyway, it is a wonderful place. Sometimes I'll just wander around here and I'll read some of the signs, some of which that I wrote, and kind of remind myself of some of the stuff in here, because there's, what, 36,000 different items we've got?
All
so that's
catalog,
a lot of stuff.
Yeah. Unbelievable. But it's a great place to come, especially if you have a passion for the sport like we do. Mm-hmm. And the wonderful people you meet along the way. We get a lot of visitors from Australia and overseas, and obviously a lot of folks know about us in far off places, and we're still trying to educate people right here at home about what a treasure we have here. So you're always welcome to come visit. We sure hope you do. And when you do, look Bob or I up. You know, we'll be able to help you out and answer your questions. If you have questions here too, you know, write them after the fact, and we'll be happy to get back to you on whatever you'd like to know.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think we'll stop it here. And like Tim said, if you have questions, leave them below. And yeah, that's about it. Tomorrow we will be talking about new products. So if you're interested in that, we'll be back again live on Facebook at 1 p.m. Central Daylight Time. So until tomorrow, we'll see you guys all then. Have a good afternoon.
Thanks, everybody.